Stoner by John Williams teaches that a life doesn't have to be dramatic, celebrated, or outwardly successful to be meaningful. Through William Stoner's quiet, often overlooked existence, the novel shows the quiet dignity of perseverance, staying true to one's values, work, and inner self despite emotional isolation, professional setbacks, and personal sorrow. It reveals how love, though fleeting, can leave a lasting impact, and how literature and learning often solace when even the world feels indifferent. Ultimately, the book reminds us that fulfillment often lies in the simple act of doing what we love and honesty and integrity, even when no one notices. Now, continuing with the Stoner. William Stoner was born in 1891 on a small farm in central Missouri, the only child of George and Edith Stoner. The land was poor, and so were the people who worked it. Life was plain, hard, and mostly silent. As a boy, Stoner rose with the sun, worked the fields, and learned not to expect more than life than the dry soil could offer. When he turned 19, his father suggested he attend the University of Missouri, where a new program in agriculture promised to teach better farming techniques. It was not a choice made out of ambition, but out of necessity. Without much ceremony, Stoner left the farm and traveled to Columbia, trading fields for lecture halls. He studied agriculture dutifully. He took chemistry, soil science, and botany. He lived simply, renting a room with a window and eating plain meals. He spoke little, listened carefully, and carried loneliness as naturally as he wore his old patched clothes. One semester, as part of his requirements, he enrolled in an introductory English literature course. Professor Archer Sloan, a sharp-eyed man with a thin voice, taught the class. Stoner expected little from it, but one day Sloan read out Shakespeare's Sonnet 73. The words struck him like a blow. The slow fading of light, the sadness of passing seasons, the nearing of death. For the first time, Stoner felt something shift inside him, something he couldn't name. After the class, he sat unmoving in his seat. When Sloan asked him a question, Stoner could not answer. "Mr. Stoner," Sloan said gently, "what does that sonnet mean?" Stoner stared, mute, as if language had abandoned him. Slowly he realized he had found something that he had lived within him always, hidden under the dust of fields and silence. That night he waked alone under the autumn sky, knowing without understanding that he could not no longer be the man he was. At the end of the semester, he changed his major to English literature. His parents were confused when he wrote to them. When he visited home during the summer, he tried to explain. His father listened quietly, but then nodded. "You do whatever you have to do," he said. Stoner never returned to the farm. William Stoner stayed on at the university, first for his bachelor's degree, then for graduate studies. He lived quietly, studying under the mentorship of Archer Sloan. The world around him began to change. Students marched off to fight in the Great War, excitement buzzing in the air. But Stoner remained. When asked why he did not enlist, he had no answer. He only knew that the pull of books, of thought, of a different kind of life was stronger than any kind of flag or uniform. Sloan encouraged him to teach. At first, Stoner stumbled through his lectures, stiff and uncertain, but little by little, he found a rhythm. A slow confidence in standing before a room of young minds. Teaching, like reading, became a part of him, deep and essential. After earning his master's degree, he accepted a small position as an instructor. His pay was modest, but it was enough. He taught freshman composition, corrected endless papers, spent nights in libraries, reading old books, falling deeper into the life he had chosen without fully understanding it. In these years, his world was small but steady. He had no close friends. He saw Sloan often, and once in a while went to department gatherings where faculty drank, gossiped, and argued about politics. Stoner listened, said little, and quietly continued his work. One evening at such a gathering, he noticed a woman standing apart from the others, pale, delicate, and still. Her name was Edith Boswick. She was the daughter of a wealthy St. Louis family and had been visiting friends. Her posture was graceful, her voice soft, her eyes distant, as if she lived behind a thin curtain the world could not touch. Something in her silence drew Stoner. Over the next few years, he called on her politely, bringing flowers or taking her to small concerts. They spoke in formal, careful words. Edith never seemed fully present, but Stoner mistook her remoteness for mystery. Without much passion and without real understanding, he proposed marriage. She accepted, and the engagement was announced with quite excitement. Edith's parents approved. A university man, they said, would give her a respectable life. They married in a small ceremony. For the first time, Stoner glimpsed Edith's deep anxiety. She seemed to regard marriage, but not as a beginning, but as an ordeal to be endured. On their honeymoon, she withdrew completely. Physical intimacy terrified her. Stoner, confused and patient, believed that in time love would grow. When they returned to Columbia, Edith set about making their small rented house into a proper home. She bought fine furniture, arranged flowers, hung paintings. She enrolled in music and art classes, pursuing hobbies with short, fierce bursts of energy that soon faded into melancholy. Stoner continued teaching, slowly building his reputation as a serious, dependable instructor. He worked on his dissertation during late nights, crafting a careful study of medieval English literature. After 2 years, he completed it, and with a Sloan support, it was published, a slim, modest book that earned quite praise. But at home, life grew heavier. Edith grew colder, withdrawing into long silences or bouts of erratic energy. Stoner tried to please her but never knew how. In time, he accepted that the marriage would not be a source of joy. He found solace in his work, in the steady rhythm of semesters, in the quiet dignity of a classroom where words still mattered. A few years into the marriage, Edith announced she was pregnant. She said it almost casually as if the news were an inconvenience, but for Stoner it sparked a small, fierce hope that something between them might change. During Edith's pregnancy, she became more distant. She refused his touch, spent long hours in her room, and often stared out the window with a blank, unseeing gaze. Stoner moved quietly around her, unsure how to bridge the growing space between them. When their daughter, Grace, was born, Stoner felt a love so immediate and pure that it overwhelmed him. He would understand by her crib for long minutes, watching her tiny chest rise and fall, feeling a connection deeper than anything he had ever known. At first, Edith seemed almost indifferent to Grace. She rarely held the baby, leaving most of the care to hired help. It was Stoner who fed Grace, changed her, rocked her to sleep in those early months. He found a kind of happiness that surprised him, a simple, selfless joy. For a short time, their home was peaceful. Edith, sensing perhaps that she was losing control, took a sudden interest in motherhood. She dismissed the servants and began managing Grace's life with rigid intensity. She set strict rules when Grace should eat, sleep, and learn. She redecorated the child's room into a miniature salon, complete with fine furniture and delicate curtains, as if the child were a fragile ornament to be displayed rather than loved. Stoner watched helplessly as Edith's coldness crept into Grace's world. The little girl, once lively, affectionate, grew quiet and helpful. She sought her father's company whenever she could, curling up beside him with her small hands in it. In the evening, Stoner would sit with Grace on his lap, reading to her, telling her stories, teaching her the gentle wonder of books. These moments sustained him. At the university, Stoner's reputation grew. His students respected him and some even admired him. Though he never sought their affection, he was promoted slowly, quietly, the kind of progress that comes not from ambition but from steady devotion. Yet at home, the atmosphere tightened. Edith grew restless. She took up new hobbies, invited genteel women to tea, and carefully shaped an image of herself as a cultured, refined hostess. Stoner became a background figure in his own house, useful for appearances, invisible otherwise. He accepted it, but with quite sadness. His love for Grace deepened, but he built his days around these small shared moments, brief flashes of tenderness that he knew could not last forever. At the university, life moved in slow, predictable rhythms, semesters rising and falling like tides. But with time, the institution began to change. New faces arrived, young men ambitious and sheer, eager to climb. Among them was Hollis Lomax, a thin, sharp-featured man with a quick mind and a sharper tongue. Lomax was brilliant but divisive. His lectures were fiery and modern, his alliances political. He admired innovation over tradition and made it clear that the old ways, the careful scholarship, and quiet dignity that Stoner valued were relics to be swept aside. At first, Stoner stayed clear of the current swirling through the apartment. He focused on teaching, on advising students on his research, but conflict found him anyway. One spring, a graduate student named Charles Walker came under Lomax's swing. Walker was ambitious, arrogant, and deeply mediocre. He lacked insight, but he spoke with a slick, confident air that disguised his weaknesses. When Walker presented his dissertation proposal under the Stoner's committee, Stoner found it sloppy and dishonest. He refused to pass the student without major revisions, demanding higher standards. Lomax, seeing an opportunity to assert his influence, defended Walker fiercely. The clash became public, ugly. The department meetings grew tense. The sides were chosen. Stoner, who had always preferred solitude to conflict, found himself isolated. In quiet moments, he wondered if he had been foolish to insist on principles, but in his heart, he knew that he had no choices. He believed in something larger than ambition, in truth, in discipline, in the silent, sacred duty of passing knowledge honestly from one generation to the next. The department chair, an old ally of Solan, tried to mediate, but soon after the chair retired, Lomax rose swiftly in influence. As revenge for the Walker incident, Lomax quietly stripped Stoner of desirable classes, assigning him only freshman service and basic writing courses. Stoner bore the humiliation in silence. To fight would only drag him deeper into the petty games he despised. He retreated inward, focusing on his students, his books, and his daughter. At home, Grace grew into a bright, sensitive girl, more attuned to sorrow than a child should be. She often sought her father's presence, sitting with him while he graded papers or following him silently from room to room. Edith, seeing this bond, felt a sharp resentment. Subtly, she worked to distance Grace from him, encouraging new habits, new friendships, new routines that edged him out. Bit by bit, Stoner's would shrink. Yet he remained stubbornly, quietly, a fixture at the university, a man unmoved by the tides of ambition, clinging to the one thing that has always sustained him, the life of the mind. In his early 40s, William Stoner had settled into a life that was small, routine, and nearly invisible. His marriage was an empty ritual. His position at the university was steady but stagnant. Even Grace, once a bright light of his days, was growing away from him under the Edith's careful manipulations. And then unexpectedly he met Katherine Driscoll. She was a young instructor, newly hired in the English department, tasked with teaching courses no one else wanted. She was plain in appearance, slender, dark-haired, with a seriousness that set her apart from the lively, ambitious crowd of new faculty. She carried herself with a quiet intelligence that Stoner recognized instantly. At first, their conversations were professional, cautious. They discussed books, lectures, students, but slowly a deeper connection grew. Unspoken but powerful, in Katherine's company, Stoner felt something he had almost forgotten, a lightness, a possibility, a stirring of his buried self. Their love, when it came simply without fanfare. One afternoon, after a long conversation in a small office, he leaned toward her and she did not pull away. Their kiss was shy, almost awkward, but it was real. In the weeks that followed, they lived in a private world outside time. They met in hidden places, quiet cafes, empty lecture halls, anonymous hotel rooms on the edge of town. In each other they found not just passion but understanding. For the first time in his life, Stoner knew what it was to be fully seen, fully loved, in Katherine's arms. The burdens of his life, the disappointments, the betrayals fell away. He remembered the boy he had been once and the young man who had first heard Shakespeare's sonnet and understood, without words, the sadness and the beauty of being alive. Their affair lasted through a semester and into another. They were discreet but not careful enough. Whispers began to circulate through a small group, gossip-hungry university community. Hollis Lomax, still nursing his old grudge, seized the opportunity. He summoned Stoner to a private meeting, thinly veiled in bureaucratic language. Lomax did not mention Katherine directly, but the threat was clear. If the affair continued, there would be consequences. Stoner understood the warning. His position was already precarious. Public scandal would ruin Katherine's career before it had begun. For days he struggled with the decision. Finally, with a heavy heart, he met Katherine one last time. They sat together in silence, their hands entwined. No dramatic words were spoken. They parted with a final kiss and an ache that would live quietly within him for the rest of his days. After Katherine left, a deep stillness settled over Stoner's life. He moved through his days with a quiet, resigned dignity. performing his duties at the university without complaint, accepting the lowly assignments Lomax gave him. The humiliation no longer stung, it was simply part of the air he breathed. At home, the distance between him and Edith grew even colder. They barely spoke. Their marriage became two separate lives, lived under the same roof. Grace, once a bright child, was growing into a troubled young woman. Edith had carefully steered her away from the stoner's influence, pushing her out toward the shallow friendships and an early engagement. Grace married young, barely out of her teens, to a man she barely knew, a union more out of escape than love. The marriage collapsed quickly. Grace's husband abandoned her, leaving her alone and pregnant. Shamed and adrift, Grace returned to Stoner's home, but the girl who had once found comfort in her father's arms was now a hallowed version of herself, seeking refuge in alcohol. Stoner watched helplessly as his daughter, his last true connection to joy, slipped away into a life of quiet despair. At the university, decades passed like slow tides. Stoner taught his classes, read his books, mentored few students who showed real promise. His colleagues aged around him, new younger faces replaced the old. The world outside wars, politics, social revolutions barely touched him. His life was contained within the walls of the university, the slow turning of seasons. In his late 50s, he began to feel the first sharp pains of illness. At first, he ignored them, chalking it up to age, but the gain grew. Persistent groaning until the doctor's visit confirmed what he had already suspected, and that is a cancer. There was little that could be done. The disease would advance unstoppable. Stoner told no one at first. He continued teaching as long as he could, moving more slowly, speaking more softly, but still finding small, steady comfort in the classroom, the last true home he had. Eventually, his body failed him. He took a formal leave from the university. There was no grand farewell, no tribute. His departure was as quiet as his life had been. He spent his final days alone in a small room filled with books and papers, the relics of a life few had noticed but which in its quiet way had been rich and full. He thought often of Katherine, on the brief happiness they had shared. He thought of Grace and of his parents long dead on the dry farm where he had been born. He thought of his work, the lectures given, the papers graded, the students who might carry some small part of him into the future he would never see. In his final hours, as the summer light softened him, he picked up one of his old textbooks. His fingers, now frail, slipped it through his pages. It fell open in his lap, and quietly, unnoticed, William Stoner died. In death, as in life, Stoner left little behind to mark his passage. There was no grand funerals, no commemorations at the university, only a handful of colleagues noted his absence. And even fewer students remembered him beyond a vague sense of respect or regret. Yet his life had not been wasted. William Stoner had lived simply, without fame, without wealth, without the trappings of the success that the world celebrates, but in the quiet, stubborn work of his days, in his loyalty to the written word. In his refusal to compromise his standards of popularity or ambition, he had lived in an integrity that few could match. He had known love, brief, yes, and painful to lose, but true. He had known sorrow in his marriage, in his daughter's unhappiness, but had faced it without bitterness. He had devoted himself to the life of the mind, to learning and teaching, to the humble belief that truth and beauty mattered even when no one else noticed. As his consciousness faded and the weight of the world slipped away, Stoner felt no fear, but a strange and a simple peace. He had lived according to who he was, not according to what others expected or demanded. The book and the Stoner's life closes with the sense that such a life, quiet with it may be, holds a profound and lasting meaning. That's it.